I mean, well, body. Text you wouldn't have caught if you're just in a sort of busy, frantic spinning. So that's essentially what we're doing here. And this method was a method that I was exposed to back in the late 60s and early 70s from my teachers and their teachers and their teachers going back. And in fact, you can see in the text itself a description. Almost all these sutras begin with a description of the time and place in the gathering. All these people gathered at this particular time and place in this particular area. They came with these sorts of questions and states of mind. The teacher, the Buddha or Bodhisattva, whoever's speaking, enters a state of samadhi, and sometimes it's very specific. It's the lion sprint samadhi or something like that. And then there is a effusion of light, which comes from that clarity and stilling, and then the words and the teachings come. And this has been historically the living tradition, it's called. And what we're trying to do here is take a little bit of that living tradition and bring it continuously back to life here in this setting. So in any event, that being said, just give you an explanation. I am promising, once again, and I always break my promises, but I'm promising to try to get through these last section of verses in chapter 9 of the Avatamsaka Sutra. There's 10 verses altogether. We're on page 48, 49 in my text. I don't know which text, if you have the same matching text.
What's the first line?
I'm going to start, well, I'm going to do the last line was, with body and mind apart from discriminations.
47.
That would be page 48.
47 for us.
47 for you, right. Shanshin li funbie. Let me include this a bit. And then I'm suggesting, and there's no fixed way to interpret these texts. It's very rich. This is Manjushri Bodhisattva speaking verses to describe what's going on and also to summarize what's happened and also, in a sense, prepare the audience for more teaching. And he's describing how a Buddha, a Tathagata, goes about teaching and transforming living beings. And the line I quoted you here, with mind and body apart from discrimination, we spent a good deal of time last week looking at that. And I was suggesting, as with all these texts, there's many technical terms here that just get translated into easy English, and that's good. On the other hand, sometimes we miss the equivalency. So apart from discrimination, body and mind free of discriminations, we spend a lot of time on, but basically I'm suggesting that that's a special Buddhist psychological term. And the discriminating mind, the funbia or prapancha mind, is a negative, unawakened functioning of the mind. It's actually considered something like a mental disturbance, and it's what we do ordinarily. So it's a mental disturbance only from the point of view of the awakened mind. It's not a clinical mental disturbance. I mean, you don't have to go out and take some pills for this, or see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But rather it's describing the mind that is unawakened. And from that point of view, from an awakened mind, this looks like a disturbance in the pattern and functioning of the mind, as it could be. But it is, quote, normal. I want to be clear about that. So when it says mental disturbance, it's like the mind, undisciplined, working in its habitual patterns, imagines and fabricates. It attaches and grasps to things that are not real, not lasting, not permanent, not even fundamentally solid. It tries to appropriate, and that's why sometimes this mind also is used as panyan, to climb on conditions, a kind of mental opportunism. It is off in the sense it doesn't see things, the nature of things as they really are, but the nature of things as we imagine them to be, which is different than things as they really are. So what it's describing, the discriminating mind, is the nature of existence through this fragmented consciousness. And I say imagine them to be either we imagine them in a liking, a fondness, or a fear. Either way, it can be imagined. The other word for Chinese for this is sometimes Wangshan, which means wrong or distorted thinking. But thinking here doesn't just mean cognitive thinking, it also means the emotions and the feelings that go along with this looking at things in this way. Some text and translation of this is I like better, is misalignment. It's sort of like it's not in tune, it's not attuned. It's a little bit off, and therefore, as you would say before digital radio, when you had the analog, you know, you could turn the tuner and you'd kind of get it, and then you get in tune, it would go off a little bit, and when you got it perfectly aligned, you'd hear it. Before that, you'd hear very bits and pieces of it. I'm sure there's other metaphors for this, like a camera focusing. If it's not perfectly focused, then what you see is misaligned, it's misrepresented. Now, when I say this is normal and average, this is indeed how the text presented. Living beings grasping, attaching, frantically moving around after things they cannot get, running away from things they can't avoid, always wishing for more, never getting what they seek, and then when they get what they seek, not being happy with it. So not getting what they want, not wanting what they get, and so on and so forth. This state is called the frantic passage through life. And as I say, from the normal point of view, this is pretty much what we all do. There's moments we have quiet and clarity and calm, but for the most part, we're pretty busy chasing our tails. And this is what the Buddha observed upon his calming of his mind and said, oh my gosh, all living beings, all sentient beings can do this with their mind and body. They can calm and center it and make it perfectly clear, like a bright mirror that reflects everything, or like still water that everything shines in very clearly. However, because of this discriminating wrong thinking, this imaginary fabricating thinking, and because they don't see things clearly, a view of things is not clear, they do not realize this state. So that was the initial statement the Buddha had upon his awakening, and was what propelled him into this teaching career of 49 years, including the text that we now have before us. And all of these are given as antidotes to this condition. So it's very relevant, even though it seems like it's far out, it's about Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and seemingly celestial states. This is really a description of the human mind as it works and the human mind as it might work, which is called awakening. So from the Avatamsaka point of view, when the Buddha has this awakening experience and declares this wondrous brightness, miaoming, that he has discovered, it isn't something that he gets, but rather something he activates already present within his being. And so he activates this inherent miaoming, this inherent brightness, and then says, interestingly, every living being has this potential. So, in one of the texts we just finished translating, and we'll be maybe talking about this more, this is from a Buddhist scholar called Han De Ching, who lived about the time of Shakespeare. He didn't know Shakespeare, I don't think, and I don't think Shakespeare knew him. But this is about the time in history where he was, wrote or spoke, and then this was copied by his disciples, this relatively long teaching to a governor, a local governor came to ask him, what's the essentials of cultivation? And so Han Shan in response gave this. But I just want to share a section of this tonight because it really hits on this theme. Han Shan talks about basically, originally, fundamentally, we all have this awakened nature, which he calls this wondrous brightness, again, miaoming. It's a luminosity, if you will. That's another word. The Dalai Lama likes to use luminous mind or luminosity to describe this, but it's the same thing. And luminous means, if you can get the image, that it lights up and reveals things as they really are. The opposite of that is a sort of darkness that comes from clinging, grasping, fear, negative emotions, and so forth. So the light either expands and reveals or contracts and distorts. So here's what Han Shan has to say. He says, we have it. This wondrous brightness, however, he says, has been obscured and polluted from beginningless time by deluded thinking, emotional anxiety, and ingrained habits, all arising from deeply rooted seeds of craving. Thus, we do not realize its full potential. Instead, we ceaselessly toil or labor away, entrapped in an illusory world of our own making. This is that line, the illusory world of our own making, and we toil away within that. It's sort of like we weave this web and then we stay confined within the web of our own making. All of it a mere construct or fabrication of our deluded thinking. Then he says, he goes on, mental constructions, he uses this idea that they're constructed. Mental constructions are like dust. Emotional attachments are like defilement. If our deluded thoughts can be stopped and dissolved, our true mind will naturally manifest as if we were polishing a mirror. This is another image that's used, it's very popular, that the mirror only reflects what comes before it. It doesn't project. It simply reflects and shows and reveals things as they really are. So it's almost like in those moments in a relationship, in a job, in some kind of encounter, some kind of trauma or distress, if for a moment the mad mind can stop, the mirror reveals and shows what's exactly going on. And there's a moment when that happens of freedom, that you actually see things as they are, your priorities shift, and you can make changes and adjustments based on that. More often than not, however, as Han Shan's saying, the dust covers it and we see through this glass darkly. We only see glimpses and images of things. But there's a wonderful sort of liberation and freedom that comes when things are seen really clearly. And it's not necessarily great joy, it's just this calm centeredness. So he says, like polishing a mirror. In the same way, once our defilements are cleansed, our bright wisdom will shine forth. Then he goes and he gives a caveat, a warning here. He says, unchecked over time, however, these unwholesome tendencies habituate, harden, and solidify. So what he's basically doing here is giving another image that if you take water and chill it, and it starts to solidify and harden First it goes into like a frosty thing and swirling around. Pretty soon it can become really, really hard. This is, what he's giving is the habituation, the unwholesome tendency over time unchecked. The checking of those is a sort of warming, or the light, if you will, and the ice then releases and goes back into a watery state. So ice and water is sometimes used in these texts to describe the awakened and the unawakened, or the afflicted, confused state, and the free-flowing, liberated state. Ice and water. The interesting thing about it is it's the same thing. The ice becomes water, water becomes ice. And so it's like psychologically, very important impulse of this is that right in the habituation of the hardened habits that I'm into is also my frozen Buddha, so to speak. And only in melting that does that Buddha come forth. It doesn't come from outside. It doesn't come from throwing the ice out or smashing the ice. Simply returning the light, warming, illuminating, and the water becomes the water of awakening. Unattended, neglected, it goes the opposite. But one of the ancient Chan texts did it this way. It says, this hand is awakening, and that's afflictions. And they go like that. And how fast was that? And he said, it was really fast. Afflictions of light, like back and forth. And he said, in the same way, from thought to thought, from emotion to emotion, feeling to feeling, you go like this, you go like this. One thought clear, you're awakened. One thought confused, you're an ordinary. One thought awakened, you're a Buddha. Next thought, you're confused again. Back and forth, back and forth. So the thing about this is a kind of very important concept called non-duality. And what non-duality means is a continuation, a continuum of matter and energy, of awakening and non-awakening in the same substance. It just depends on use. So you can see the takeaway from this is Dharma is to be used. It's a mechanism. It's a thing to be used, not a thing to be appropriated or simply memorized or sort of philosophically articulated. But it's actually to be like medicine taken and have the corresponding catalytic response. And then interestingly, once that response happens, we'll go into this a little tonight, the Dharma has served its purpose. And it's no longer useful in the same way that medicine, once causing the ailment to go away, shouldn't be taken anymore. So, the next line then of the text is explaining, and this I see as a turning verse. So then there should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 verses after this. And I've just interpreted this. Isn't necessarily how you have to do it, but within all worlds, that's the verse I'm looking at now. And those of you who know the Chinese, please say it loudly. I'm going to read this really quietly, but you who know the Chinese, please say it loudly. Then you'll think I know Chinese, and I'll trick you. So we're looking at this line, 一切, right? 一切是见中，处处转法轮，无心无 Come on, 无所传，大事方便说. Thank you. Anything people listening heard wrong, it was because the audience was not pronounced. Within all worlds and in all places, he, the Tathagata, a Buddha, turns the Dharma wheel, yet it is without a nature and without a turning. Thus the guiding master speaks expediently. This is a wonderful line. But what I'm suggesting, if we go back to Han Shan, solidified, hardened, habituated, we become tied in these knots and so forth. The Dharma then comes forth as the antidote. So this fifth verse here is saying now we move to the positivity of Dharma as the releasing medicine, the antidote. The interesting thing about this verse, I mean, there's many ways to come at this, but it's saying, first of all, within all worlds and all places. This is another level of not discriminating. So a sage, a Buddha, a bodhisattva, does not discriminate in that sense between different living beings. Ethnicity, culture, time or place, all have this potential, and therefore the vows take them to all these different places without making those discriminations. Turning the Dharma wheel, and yet it says it's without a nature and without a turning. This is like kind of how shall I say, paradoxical or maybe even inconsistent. Well, he turns the Dharma wheel without turning. I think this means that essentially there is no Dharma or Dharma wheel except as a response to the adharma state of living beings. If living beings are awakened and unconfused, there is no Dharma. Dharma arises because of the ailments and confusions of living beings. So we get away from this sort of Dharma as some sort of divine, out there, absolute truth, and more, and that's the word you hear, he speaks expediently, more as a device or mechanism to serve as the antidote or counter to the confusion. Once it's served its purpose, the natural awakening state comes of itself when it's freed from this. It's not something that has to be given. So Dharma doesn't have a nature of its own. It only arises out of this necessity. And that, I like this line too, they use the guiding master, because in this sense, what it's pointing to is that the teacher, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, is a guiding master, like a, what am I saying? When you go to some place and you need a guide, when I'm up in Maine, I rely on a couple of friends on the lake who are Maine guides, and they can take me deep into the wilderness and show me how to survive, or try their best to show me how to survive. Sometimes I don't listen and I get stuck. But if I listen, they can show me how to survive, even how to survive overnight if I lose my way and so forth. If I try this without a guide, it's very easy for me to get lost and get... So the Buddha here, the sage of Trinity, as a guiding master, not as a savior. It's not a savior, and not as a god, but really someone who guides. And the guide is to actually help you get there on your own. So this is a very different imagery of the enlightened being or the teacher. A good teacher doesn't want a bunch of disciples. He wants to open the cage and let them all fly. He wants to liberate life. He or she then only sets up conditions for self-discovery and self-realization, and does what has to be done. Sometimes encouragement, sometimes scolding, but whatever gets you to fly, that's the goal, and to leave and be on your own. So guiding master is the one I like. I will quote another passage from a text to sort of bring out this point of the Dharma has no nature of its own expedient. This is from the Platform Sutra. Platform Sutra, most of you know about this one, right? We've lectured it here before. Basically, it was the recorded teachings of an illiterate master called Huineng, who was then the sixth patriarch in the Chinese Chan lineage. And this is from his teachings. He says, good and wise friends. He always addressed his audience as good and wise friends. And some people say, oh, he's playing to the crowd. He wasn't really playing to the crowd. He was saying to them, you are indeed good and wise people, if only you can see through it and put it all down. So it was like an encouragement to them, to that inherent nature that he was speaking. He says, good and wise friends, all of the sutras and writings of the great and small vehicles and the 12 divisions of the canon, the sacred text, all of these were established because of people and could have only been set up because of their wisdom nature. This is a wonderful line. So all of the teachings, the sutras, are only coming about because of people. If there's no people, then there's no teachings in Dharma. Whoa. But then the other part is, and only could be set up because of their wisdom nature. In other words, could only be set up because they had that inherent nature that could be activated. Otherwise, it's a whole different game. So they come as activations of an inherent capacity. And because there's that capacity, there can be the teachings. So this is very interesting. And he goes on, if there were no people in the world, all the myriad Dharma teachings would not exist by themselves. This is going back to the line, has no nature of its own. Therefore, you should realize that the myriad Dharma teachings arise because of people, and all sutras are taught and explained for people. This is something that early on, when I first read a text like this, before I met my teacher at Gold Mountain Monastery, I saw these as very esoteric and almost obscure or mystical or beyond the human. They were describing altered states of consciousness and attainment that were not in the human, to me. But his way of approaching this was just as stated in this last line. All sutras are taught and explained for people. And so part of the reading of the text and part of the way we were encouraged and trained to teach the text was to bring it back into the human, bring it back into the human realm and not make it far out and esoteric and of another realm. So his method of teaching was, do not say that these are not about the human. They're deeply about the human. However shallow or deep you realize your own nature, this is describing all that's available to you, all that you might become. And then you ask yourself, where am I now in regard to this continuum of understanding? And then you go to work. But don't deify it and don't put it out there so much as almost, I hate to say this because it's such a weird expression, but it is all about me. So you have to kind of do it that way. This is about me. And if you look at it that way, it takes on a whole different meaning. So, one more from the Platform Sutra. This is also Huineng, who did the same thing when someone asked him what was his teaching, capital T. His response was, if I said I had a teaching to give to others, I would be deceiving you. Depending on the situation, I merely use expedients to untie people's bonds and provisionally call it samadhi, or call it a teaching. So what Huineng is saying is very much what the Avatamsaka is saying here. Expediently untie the knots or melt the ice, if you go back to the previous metaphor, and I call that a teaching. Whatever works to do that is dharma. And if it doesn't do that and doesn't work to do that, it's not dharma. So dharma is what dharma does. Dharma should liberate, awaken, decrease afflictions and worry and suffering. It should produce clarity and a sort of ethical sensibility and bearing. All these things should be what dharma does. If it's not doing that, it is not dharma for you. It may be dharma teaching for someone else. So that's why you have to sort of look at this. Again, this also comes out of the Lankavatara Sutra. If the teaching is not to the person and to the place, to their conditions, it's not a teaching. So this is really coming back to the dharma is this lubricant, if you will, to untie, unbond, to free up. Once that purpose is served, the dharma's purpose is over with, because the freeing up is, in fact, the essential nature. So I could say more about this, but I just wanted to be clear. It isn't to slander the dharma and say there is no dharma. There is dharma. But dharma is defined by untying these bonds, opening and revealing the mind in all its states. It's bringing it back to the human. And if it does that, it's dharma. That's why the expedient has everything to do with speaking or teaching or delivering the right medicine to the right person at the right time. It's not that it's all is given. Sometimes we go to it naturally. We just are drawn to something that resonates with us or makes sense to us. And the other teachings, just like water off a duck's back, that's fine. Because it's meant to resonate with a particular existential condition you're in and to do its work. As you move along, different knots, different states arise, and different teachings will then correspondingly make sense or be relevant. So it's not like one has to feel as if I have to study or learn it all so much to understand what its purpose is. It's functional. This expedient then goes to a passage I was thinking of from the Lotus Sutra. Oh, some of you also read the Lotus Sutra, right? Or heard about the wonderful Dharma Lotus Sutra. The first part of that text, especially the first couple of chapters, is devoted almost exclusively to the idea of fangbian, or upaya, expedient, skillful means. And in this sutra, a quote a passage from this: a Tathagata perceives the goal of all teachings and knows the underlying mental dispositions of all sentient beings, and explains all the teaching using his wisdom and skillful means. People, living beings, have differing desires, inclinations, attachments, potentials, a huge emotional range of degree and kind. And these are what make up their patterns, the habituated patterns. They're sort of the paradigm they're in. And so what the text is saying here, the Buddha or Tathagata finds the corresponding key or liberating mechanism that opens that paradigm out of paralysis into a shift. If you can use this language, some of you are familiar with that paradigm shift, paradigm paralysis, and so forth. This is something that's used in science. So we lock in, and then whatever will release that is what the teaching is Dharma for us. So for some people, it's encouraging words. For some people, it's a feeling of shame, a conscience ridden. For some people, it's inspiration. For some people, it's desperation. For some people, it's awe and fear. And for other people, it's compassion and melting kindness. Whatever it is that opens up the full human potential, that's what the expedient mechanism is. So, for example, you have many Dharma doors within Buddhism: bowing, meditation, repentance and reform, precepts, memorizing text, chanting, reciting Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, making offerings, giving, all kinds of methodologies that one uses. All of them are serving one purpose, is to open and expand this nature, this deep essential nature. So often what a Buddha or Bodhisattva will do, if somebody's really dissolute and morally bankrupt, they'll encourage precepts. Refrain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, drugs and intoxicants, and lying. For someone who's scattered and really frenetically busy, they'll start to encourage stillness, meditation. For people who can't do that but need to have a centering device and need to bring their minds off of busyness, they might just do chanting. For people who are carrying a lot of guilt and shame and remorse and can't unlock that knot, that it turns into a sort of a paralyzing guilt, they'll do repentance and renewal, so that you, on one hand, acknowledge and recognize what it was, and at the same time, then wash it away and move on. And that becomes a very liberating. So it depends on where a person's at, where the conditions are. And the Lotus Sutra basically is just saying that's what a Tathagata does. And then it describes in that text all these different capacities and potentials that these people have, and how the Buddha responds according to each one. What was interesting was when the Buddha, in the Lotus Sutra, when he has this full awakening, there's a passage where he says, I don't think I can teach this. This is so far out and difficult from the ordinary state of mind to realize that I have this full awakening potential and finally realized it. How am I possibly going to share this with anybody else? Ordinary beings are very difficultly tied up, and then go back to Hanshan's habituated, hardened tendencies and so forth. And so he says, basically, to even listen to and accept and understand this notion is very, very difficult for people. Very, very difficult. So the Buddha actually is at that time thinking, I don't think I can teach. In any event, he's exhorted by some devas, some gods, who say, please, do this, teach, turn this Dharma wheel. And he says, how can I do this? And then he has this thought. It's a really wonderful moment in the text. He says, the Buddha says, then I thought of the power of skillful means practiced by all past Buddhas. And when he had that thought, he suddenly had a way that he could teach, and then the teaching began. And if you look at the text this way, you'll see every time you read a text, sometimes it's to a 7-year-old child, sometimes it's to a serial killer, sometimes to a king or a concubine, sometimes to a sage, sometimes to a derelict. And you'll notice in each one, the teaching changes, but matches to that potential as the liberating mechanism to take that person out of that particular state. And so it's really pretty cool if you understand expedient means. When you read these texts, reverse engineer and imagine who this is being said to, but more importantly, psychologically and emotionally, where they're setting up and how this would be then. And this avoids also this idea of there's one Dharma, this Dharma is the only and absolute Dharma, and that you push on others and say you have to meditate. If you don't meditate, you won't get enlightened. Not true. Not true. That's why the expedient mechanism here is so wonderful. Anyhow, wow. Okay. Well, I'm breaking my promise. I was going to go on and finish this section, and obviously it's not going to happen. So I'm going to do one more thing, and then Jinchuan, are you going to talk tonight? Okay. So I like poetry a lot. It's in my blood. My grandmother made me memorize poems when I was a kid, and I'm forever bitterly grateful. But I've been sharing poems with you almost every class, and tonight I wanted to share one too. This is continuing from last week, and the poet, I said, Po Chui, and people are, no, that's wrong. It's Bai Jui, right? Some people actually winced. It's Bai Jui, not Po Chui. Well, as I did my research, it turns out that it's sometimes Bo Jui, or Bai Jui, or Po Chui. Okay? Sorry. It's like my name. What is it? Well, some people say Verhoeven. My grandmother said Verhoeven. My grandfather said Vanderhoeven. His grandmother said Vanderhoeven. And they were all right. Because depending on where you look at this, there was all the variations of the name. I'm not saying Bai Jui, Po Chui is the same. I'm just saying if you look it up, okay, so I stand exonerated. So he was an amazing poet. He wrote all kinds of things, satirical ballads and poems. He did believe, and I like this philosophy, that good poetry should be readily availably understood by common people, and should have really simple diction, a natural style, and social content. So he was an engaged poet. He wasn't just writing poetry for virtuosity's sake or abstraction. His life was mixed. In some ways he was very successful. He passed these exams, basically the equivalent of acing his SATs and that whole thing, or his, what is the law thing? What is that? What do you take for law? LSAT, thank you. What do you take? Do you take anything for medicine? Oh, there's all these SATs, SAT. So you're getting all these SATs. He got the SATs of the time and got this position. But he also was really blown away by the poverty he saw. And also he was the militarism, the heavy taxation, the extravagance of the court, and the official abuses. All things of the past, by the way. We don't have those anymore. This bothered him. And so he went back and forth. He has this poetic longing to be in nature and to write about Chan, because he was a real sitting meditator. On the other hand, he had these callings or this vocation to be an official. couple of things changed his life. One, I'm guessing he got very ill and sank into despondency for a while because his mother and then his young daughter died within weeks of each other. And this is very hard. And often you see in these poets and also in these sutra texts, the turning moment when someone goes from the ordinary to unite with their spiritual is one of these moments when you experience death or dying firsthand. We think about it, we know about it, but until it's in the nostrils, until it's really close, we keep it distant, and then it comes in and has an awakening effect, actually, a stimulus. So that was part of his thing. He once said that literature should be written to serve one's own generation and poems and songs to influence public affairs. After he did this thing and tired of the official life, he pulled back and found a place to live carefree and at leisure. And the only thing that disturbed him was the passing again of family members and friends. This is something he couldn't escape. And you see this in his poetry, although he's gifted and he's eloquent, and he's found this leisure and this freeness of being in nature, that he could not escape mortality, both of members of his family and friends, and as he gets older, you see him reflecting on his own. So he took these all into his lonely old age. He continued to write poems. Usually, some people say about 3,500 by the time the final collection was done in 839. So he's in the Tang Dynasty. Now, this last line of his biography struck me, and I don't like it, but I'll tell you it. The last years of his life were uneventful. I don't think that's true. You know, if you're doing what he's doing and writing poetry in this way and really, really deeply activating the soul of the muse, it's not uneventful at all. And I'm going to read you a poem tonight that contradicts what this person wrote about his life being uneventful. Mostly what we take to be eventful is uneventful. If you go back to all the parties and the blah, 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 they all seemed eventful, and now we look back, they're pretty uneventful. And the things that we seemed were uneventful at the time often turn out to be the most eventful. So you go on a 1-week retreat, seems uneventful. And yet that 1-week retreat can be the turning point in your life when you look back and say, that was a very significant moment. Anyhow, this line I don't like either. He died in September of 1846. And then the line says, at an advanced age of 74. Excuse me? He's younger than I am. It's not an advanced age of 74. Anyhow, I want to read you one of his poems tonight. And the poem I like, this one, is called Madly Singing in the Mountains. One of the reasons I'm reading this poem is that it was the title of a book about one of my favorite translators, Arthur Waley. Arthur Waley did the best translation, I think, of the Tao Te Ching, and it's all Japanese literature and Chinese literature. He was just a gifted translator. But nonetheless, there's a biographical sketch of his poem, His Life and Thing, and it's called Madly Singing in the Mountains, because he liked this poem so much. So here's the poem. There is no one among men that has not a special failing, and my failing consists in writing verses. I've broken away from the 1,000 ties of life, but this infirmity still remains behind. Each time I look at a fine landscape, each time that I meet a lovely friend, I raise my voice and recite a stanza of poetry and marvel as though a god had crossed my path. So we talked about this last week, he had a poetry demon that he could not help from writing. Han Shan De Ching, the one I quoted earlier, also reported that he had a poetry demon. Couldn't escape from this. The other part of this, though, why I think Arthur Waley liked this, each time I raise my voice and recite or translate a passage of text, not just recite a stanza of poetry, but translate, because Arthur Waley's a translator, I marvel as though a God had crossed my path. Whaley once described his work of translation as this, as if gods had come across his path and he could translate these texts into English. And he entered a samadhi while he was doing this. One of the ancient texts say translation of these texts is the work of the devas. It's the work of the gods. And when you get involved in this kind of translation, I'm sharing this with you, you are transported to another realm and time and place that is absolutely just wondrous. So those of you who have the language ability are thinking about doing this, go ahead, because translation is, in a sense, you marvel that a God has just crossed your path and get involved in. So I will stop there tonight. Arthur Whaley never went to China or Japan. He married, let's see, when he died, I see how old he was when he died. He died in 1966, so 86, about 80, I think he's about 80 years old. Yeah, and he married 1 year before he died. He was so gifted that when he was at school, his classmates would take little pieces of foreign languages like Urdu or Sanskrit or Pali or some obscure Scandinavian script, and they'd just take a little bit of it and they'd put it on his nightstand. And then they'd make bets how long it would take him to translate it. And of course, the way they knew it was translated, he'd go to his room and the light would go on by his desk. And then they'd watch and watch and watch. And when the light went off, they knew he translated it. And then you could always hear, I won, you lost, but he would doggedly stay with it until he actually translated it. So those of you who want to read some of the better translations of the Taoist works, Confucian works, and Japanese works, look up Arthur Whaley. I'll stop there tonight. That was my poem.
You didn't finish the poem. That's only half of the poem.
Yeah, really? Do you want to finish the other half?
No.
Oh. Next week? I get accused of this all the time. I didn't finish the poem. I didn't finish the text I was going to do. When I was a kid, I used to say to my parents, take me time. And I don't know if it meant I take my time and get off my case, or I meant to say, it takes me time to do this. Anyways, my grandfather said I wouldn't finish, and I'd be late for my own funeral. So next week, we'll do the other half. Or if you're here, you do the other half.
Testing, okay. Sound okay? I know we're getting it from another place right now, right? From the Brio? Oh, okay, good.
Do you need to move the camera?
He's using this one.
Oh, okay.
Locke has become more technically savvy. So it's very nice to see actually everyone here. It's quite nice to actually have real people in the monastery. Usually we're just talking to this camera. So I was thinking about sharing a story tonight on a little bit of the theme that Marty was talking about around expedient means. And it's something that we've been talking a little bit about in the monastery. If people have kind of followed Jing Wei Shi and myself at all over the last couple of years, we discovered this program called Guiding Rage into Power. I don't know, how many people have heard of this program with Jing Wei Shi and myself talking about it? Actually, only maybe 3, okay? So let me explain a little bit about it. It's a program that's actually in San Quentin, one of the probably most difficult places to live. And the founder of the program, named Jack Verdin, goes in and actually works with those prisoners in a way to train them to become peacemakers. And what Jingwei and myself, actually we were introduced to it by one of the ERBU student who worked as a facilitator in this program. And as we looked at the program, it amazed us at how skillful this man had, you could essentially said, delivered the Dharma to this population, to really heal them, to really help them. So I'll give you a couple of the things that they do in this activity, and maybe I'll go into the story. But so for instance, the first thing he has these men do, they come in and they sit in a group in a circle, maybe 30 men. And he asks them a question. How long have you served in prison? And one by one they go around, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. So they go around, and the number could be something like, 742. 742 years. And he just lets the silence for a little while, so that number settle in. And that actually becomes the name of the tribe, name of the group. So they refer to 742. Then he asked them a second question. He said, how long did it take from the moment you felt imminent danger? And he defines it as things start to speed up, experience starts to intensify, and after you do something, you regret it. That moment you get kind of triggered to the moment you committed the crime that got you into jail. So these men go back around. 5 seconds, 2 seconds, 3 minutes, come back 20 minutes. So you ask them, so 20 minutes of time for almost a millennia of life, is it worth it? So in this program, we're teaching you never to miss a moment like that again in your life. So it's guiding rage into power. And so he works with these men to essentially help them connect with their emotions, to be able to really get in touch with what's going on inside of themselves, to really meet the harm that they've done in their lives and heal that, to pray for those that they've harmed. And it's pretty amazing. It's quite shocking. I just went and checked out the numbers. And so he has 1,233 graduates from the program. It's a year-long program. And they're pretty much all lifetime, they're sentenced for life. But they potentially have a chance to get out to go before the board, to basically get released. And it's usually very difficult to do so. But of the group, 421 have been released. And of the 421 that have reoffended and gone back to jail, 2. 2 people. He said for nonviolent crimes. And so if you look at 99.8%, you say quote unquote success rate, having these men go from a life of crime and pain to one of peace and healing. So I'll tell you one of the stories that we just, we watched a video of him giving a talk as a community here, and it really touched me. He said at one point, he's been working in the prisons for a long time, devoted his life to this. I think the state sent him a letter asking him to talk to a prisoner on death row because the mother of a victim of his wanted to meet him. And so he looked at the letter, he looked at the case, he said, okay, I'll do it. So when he looked at the case, there was a boy that got killed very horribly, so I won't go into details, at like 9 years old. And so, and he himself has a 9-year-old kid, so you can feel the emotions and the pain that the parent would go through from losing their child. So he goes in and he meets with this person on death row. He looks at him, he says, there's a request from the mother of the boy that you killed to meet with you. And the man completely denied, I didn't do it. It's not me. So no, this woman really wants to have a conversation with you. He wouldn't have it. So Jack went back and he called the woman up and said, I know you wish to talk to this person, but I think it probably won't probably re-traumatize you again. Re-traumatize you. He said, because, this story, I really want to come out and meet you. So he goes out and he flies to where she was. And she sees that in her house, she has all the pictures of him still, all the newspaper clippings, because it's such a horrible crime. It was in national news. And it's just something that he could see she's been reliving over and over in her mind, in her heart. So he talks to her about it. He says, so why do you want to meet this man? He said, I'm not going there to forgive him or to really kind of have a connection with him. I just have one question. I just want to know, what were my son's final words when he died? Because I keep playing that story through my mind over and over and over again. If I could just know that, at least maybe I'll have some peace. Okay. So Jack heard that, and he went back to this group of men that he works with. Right, imagine 30 men in San Quentin serving lifetime sentences. And he tells a story to these men. He says, would it be all right if we invited her here to our group? And they said, yeah. He said, they thought about it, yeah. So she might ask some difficult questions. For sure she's going to ask, what were the final words of the people that you've killed? What were their words? What happened? What were you feeling? And they said, okay. Because it's an opportunity to maybe help somebody, to be in service. So this woman comes. And exactly as Jack said, she went into the circle, and these 30 guys. And she's there. And she asked them one by one, what happened in the crime that got them into jail? What were their feelings? What were that person's final words? And Jack says, it was interesting. He said, it was painful, it was difficult, but as story after story came out, somehow the space became elevated, almost became sacred. These truths were being told. Painful truths, but truths. And after the circles went around, in the kind of sense of stillness and holding, the man says to her, I always wanted to ask for forgiveness from the person I killed, from the victims of my life. Can I ask you for forgiveness? And so he goes up to her and actually, asks her for forgiveness. And she forgives him. And one by one, each man goes to her and asks for forgiveness. And she forgives each one. And so after that, you can just imagine kind of the energy, some of these circles. They ask her, can you share any joyful experience you have with your son? And Jack describes how all of a sudden the energy in the room shifted into a kind of celebration of this boy's life. And so when this woman left, she left healed in her heart. And for these men, they were able to be touched and transformed in a very real way. And so these stories we were listening to, and these many stories like this, it's the kind of deep inner honesty and kind of changing and repentance and real renewal that was like, wow, and really giving them the tools for how to work with their emotions. And so we're talking about expedient means. Jingwei myself like this. If there was an Earth Store Bodhisattva, someone working in the most difficult of places, this is somebody who's embodying that spirit. Working with skill, It's interesting, when we looked at the things that he's put together, if you didn't know Buddhism, you wouldn't think it's Buddhist, because it just seems so simple. But if you have the Dharma, you actually know, actually this is like word for word from the precepts, word for word from our teachings, from the Buddhist teachings. But he's just kind of adapted it so precisely for that group that it just works. So if anything, it's something that we really find inspiring. And if people have the chance, you can go to their website. I think it's called griptraining.org or something. If you look Guiding Rage into Power Training, you'll be able to find their website. And there's a trailer on the very first page. I know Jingwei Sure myself probably watched it like 100 times by now. every moment we watch, we get a chance, we watch it, and every time it still touches my heart. You see these men share their stories from the heart. Wow. If I could have that kind of courage and honesty, it would be, something really to learn from. So talking about expedient means, that's something I felt was really, really meaningful. Okay. Maybe say announcements. I just want to announce we have a retreat coming up this summer from June 3rd to June 10th, 2023 at the Suna Center, titled Mindfulness to Heartfulness. And it'll be led by our senior teachers. And if you want more information, you go to extension.drbu.edu/summer-2023. And so if you would like to join, I would recommend signing up sooner rather than later because the spaces are quite limited. Okay. I don't know if there's anything else. I think our schedule is pretty much the same for the rest of the week. We have our recitation tomorrow, and we have from 12:30 to 1 and 2 to 3, maybe 2 to 3, okay. And we also have our, Verhoeven's lecture on Saturday night. He also lectures on Sunday night on the CDTB Live website. And I think if you look at our Berkeley Monastery website, you'll see many of the regular BBM teachers still teaching online. For instance, Stephen Tainer on Wednesday, Thursday, I think James Baraz's group, and so forth. And also just so people know, Abaya Giri monks will also be coming back for the first Tuesday in May. I don't think it's something like May 2nd. I think they'll be coming to do the first Tuesday here at Berkeley Monastery. Okay, so really happy to see so many people here in person. Definitely feels different. Okay, let's maybe dedicate merit. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all whose sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.